In this episode, you'll learn about the risks of abrupt changes in your training and some surprising outcomes from practice lineups, rigging, and winter to summer transitions.
Feel the grip of the oar handle, smooth yet firm in your hands. Taste the salt of your own sweat and the occasional splash of water. It's all part of the journey. Welcome to another episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Each week, our host, Masters rowing coach Rebecca Caro, dives deep into the world of Masters rowing. Whether you're on the water or in the gym, join us to become a faster master. Let's go rowing.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode. And today we've got an interesting topic, which is abrupt training changes. And it's not so much about the abruptness or the training change, but the effect that this has had on Masters rowers and their plans for the season. I'm delighted to welcome to the show Marlene Royle, of course, my co-founder. We started this project together. Marlene, welcome back.
Good to be here, and hello to our audience.
So it's lovely to see you again, and you're obviously looking very tan, so you must be somewhere warm.
Close to the equator.
There we go. I think we're 52 below. And the only reason I know that, I think there's a vodka brand in New Zealand. Oh, it's 42 below. Sorry, 42. Right. Now, you wrote me and said, look, these abrupt changes in training are a real red flag that you told me a lot of people aren't aware of. So what was the one thing that made you think this would be a really worthwhile podcast for us?
Well, I find that every racing season, there always seems to be some trend, for good or for bad. And last season, I saw a trend of injuries that happened mid to late, say mid-season, late summer, for some athletes who were focusing on their fall racing. And these circumstances really derailed their entire racing season. And when I started probing into, well, okay, so what happened? What was going on? What was happening when XYZ happened, which we'll talk about? I found that all of these circumstances were the results of making quick changes or getting into unfamiliar boats and doing another coach's training session on top of some hard work that they've already been doing. And it was just enough to push things that have been maybe like little causes of concern injury-wise, push things over the top and then completely derail them. And I just thought that all of the three examples were so avoidable. And so I think you sent me a message and I thought, oh, well, this since we're approaching, for the North American rowing season anyway, we're approaching the transition of people coming off indoor training and starting to move onto the water. So, this is always, a transition period of time is always a time to be extra careful in training, not so much from the physiological point of view, but from the point of view of letting your muscles and your tendons adapt to different stresses. And, going from the rowing machine, and it might depend, like if you're rowing on an indoor rower, that's a sculling type machine, and you're going into a single or a sculling boat, obviously a lot of the upper body action is going to be similar, but you're not going to have the movement of the water, the changes in balance. A lot of small postural muscles that have to work on the water don't get fatigued easily because you don't necessarily use them as much when you're on the indoor rower. Or if you've been rowing on an indoor rower that has a straight handle, and now you're going to go into a sweep boat, which has a lot of rotation, and you might be in a big boat that's perhaps it's balanced, perhaps it's not balanced. you're putting a lot of different stresses on your tendons. So you have to approach these transitions carefully, because it is a time when it's easy to get injured.
That's for sure. An injury, if I understand you correctly, was the main outcome from all of these different things that happened last season. That was your theme.
Yes. So, and all actually related to tendons, tendons or a muscle strain. So,
So the first transition you've already mentioned, coming off the indoor rower or tank and coming onto the water. Rule of thumb, I think we always used to say, start at 50% volume and increase 75% a week or 2 weeks later, and then full training volume maybe after 4 weeks. And that, of course, allows for the fact that for some people, the weather isn't conducive. You won't, go straight on the water and be on the water every day at that time of year.
Right, because spring weather tends to be, depending on your hemisphere, spring or fall can be windy or choppy or cold. But I also think it's a good mix to maintain some of your indoor rowing when you're transitioning to the water, because also from a fitness point of view, you won't get on the water and work as hard in the boat as you will on the rowing machine. But your time use your time in the water for technique, and don't make those sessions too long. Think of, well, I'm going to row 45 minutes because I can row well for 45 minutes before that muscle fatigue sets in. And then perhaps you can always get on the rowing machine and do a short session the same day, or do a combination, for example, but something that keeps your fitness level up while you're, letting your body adapt to the different motions on the water.
So one of the other changes you mentioned was rigging. Now, what rigging changes might people suddenly make?
Well, here's one example. There was a woman, very good sculler, and she had generally been dealing with a little bit of lateral epicondylitis. So that's your tennis elbow, which is a common place where rowers can have irritation, because that's a point of deceleration. When your arms come back and your elbows come back, when your elbows have to change direction, that puts stress right on that attachment of the tendon. And she was dealing with a little bit of it at the end of winter training, but it was manageable with, being careful. However, she changed her oar grips on her sculling handles. And they were new grips, but they were a slightly different size. And she put new grips on, went out, started rowing. And of course, enthusiastic to be on the water, probably rowed a bit too much. And it flared the tendinitis up extremely. And it really sidelined the whole beginning of her season for quite a long time. And her orthopedic doctor actually said that probably the trigger was the change of the grip size of your handles, because even though it doesn't seem like a big change from a biomechanical point, it is a different stress. And it just might been enough to, have something that was being managed. It was just enough to put it over the top. And so I would say, if you're going to, put on new grips, which everybody likes getting new grips, you might want to, the ideal would be to have 2 pairs of oars, but not everybody has 2 pairs of oars. But I would say, at first, be a little bit careful your first few rows to make sure that nothing starts to hurt or give you signals that this feels a little bit uncomfortable. Because with any rigging change, as well as, changing your span or changing the loads on your oars, if you start to feel an irritation or a little bit of pain where you didn't feel it before, that's often a red flag that, your body hasn't adapted to that, or perhaps the load is a little bit too heavy. those are just things that, pay attention to very small things.
Yeah. And can I ask, was the grip size larger or smaller that she swapped to?
It was a little bit smaller, actually.
Okay. Right.
But, just enough, again, it can be
gripping
just
a bit more.
Yeah, just enough of a change, or say a little bit. My guess would be, a little bit more arc over the handle could also put the tendon on a little bit more stress. And certain things we don't know, like how does this person feather and square, because that can also come into play of how much they're doing in their fingers, or how much are they gripping and flexing their wrist, which can also cause a little bit more stress. So but it's just something I think for even sweep rowers, maybe they start rowing with a new set of oars at the club. So it's any change, just to be aware. I think awareness can take you very far in this sense.
Give us another example of one of the unfortunate tendon situations you had last season.
So another, all three happen to be women in this case. So I'm not saying that it's more a women's issue, but it just, in this case, happens to be. There was a woman, quite competent, sort of upcoming competitive sculler, and she had a slight strain in her glute, and also like around her tendon near her sacrum, because this is an area where you have a lot of tendons that come off your sacrum that go into your glutes and stabilize your pelvis. And she had been feeling a little bit of fatigue on and off through the season, because this is now perhaps August. But it was something that was manageable with a little bit of rest, and just making sure not to push herself, to become very fatigued in a given training session. And she'd been working on her own program in her single, but she does do some rowing with her club. So she had a very pretty high quality training session in her single on Friday. Saturday, they needed somebody to row in a double. So she rowed a double with another club member who she doesn't normally row with. And they had a very nice long row, but the boat isn't rigged the same as her single. It's maybe a little bit too high. Biomechanics were not exactly the same. The next day, the club has their Sunday row in the quad, and they do a race simulation. So this is for a head race. So they did a hard head race piece. And again, different rigging. The boat's rigged too high. The boat's a little bit big. This is a relatively petite woman. The boat's a little bit too big. She felt a little bit uncomfortable, a little more aggravated than when she was focusing on her single. But then the next day, they needed another person in the quad. So she filled in the quad, and they did another head race trial. And by the end of this is now like the fourth day in a row. But two of these trials in the row in a quad, in a boat that really didn't fit her properly, really pushed this ligament strain and glute strain over the top. And essentially, she had to stop rowing at that point and had to stay out of the boat for about a month. Going to PT and had to swim. Just couldn't even bike. Biking was too painful, so had to really swim. Just scale everything down, and she was able to do a couple of races, but they were really like, she did as well as she could rowing down the course, but it certainly wasn't where, if she had gone into it healthy, she probably would have had a much better result. So that was just an example of having your own training program where you've got enough work in the week, but then getting pulled into a situation where you really just piled too much on in 3 or 4 days. And if you're dealing with some kind of a slight injury or something that you're paying attention to, that was just enough to put it over the top. Plus the boat didn't fit very well. It was too big, rigged too high, so it was just a combination of bad factors.
And certainly it's often the case that you think you're doing a kindness to somebody by saying, yes, I'll go in your quad, but sometimes you just have to be selfish and say, no, I have to prioritize me, and this quad is not a priority for me.
Yeah, and that's very difficult to do oftentimes in a club situation, especially if you do mix in with some of the boats sometimes. So I can appreciate the position, but I think the message is really listen to your body. Yes, and common sense. Listen if you really feel like you've been at the limit, and think, well, okay, I can maybe I can make it through one more practice. Well, that practice might be the last practice for a while. So I think it's, and for masters, everything takes much longer to heal. Yep. So, a soft tissue injury at best for an average person takes 6 to 8 weeks to heal at best. So, if you start looking at missing all that time in your season, which you're, looking forward to all year, that can be a real drag, I think.
Absolutely. And of course, common sense isn't very common. Marlene,
yeah.
Go on.
Oh, I was going to say the other example, shorter explanation, but a similar condition, masters women rower. She trains with a regular doubles partner. They've rowed together for many, many years. So they have their own boat. They know each other. They train together. They race together. And they started to want to go to a neighboring club so that they had some other people to row with, because they essentially train by themselves. And they visited a nearby club, and again, the same thing. They got into a quad. The coach gave them, it was a relatively hard session. It wasn't just a steady state row. And they hadn't ever rowed in this combination, and they were in a different boat. And again, different rigging from what you're very much accustomed to of rowing in your own boat, which was very precisely rigged for them. And it ended up in this woman straining her hamstring, which then she had to start going to physical therapy. And again, this put her out for the majority of her training in the beginning of the fall. And she did end up rowing in her most important race, but it was I would say a very cautious row because her hamstring really wasn't 100%. And a hamstring is just something like, if you've ever had a hamstring strain, certainly in the boat, it's just something, it's very difficult not to pay attention to it. It can be quite uncomfortable in a rowing shell. But again, it was, I think, just the combination of different rigging, rowing with different people who probably rowed different styles, and we don't know how set the boat was. And, we don't know what the level of these other scullers are. So, this is just something that perhaps the athlete's a little bit tired. Maybe you're going into this a little bit tired. That can also set you up for higher risk. So just things, I think, just to give our audience, just keep these things in mind. Even though you're enthusiastic, you still have to be aware that you need to take care of your joints and your ligaments, and rowing with good technique, and hopefully in boats that are relatively stable and not going to create problems and are going to create enjoyment.
Yeah, exactly. And when you get in a wobbly boat, one of the temptations is to stop rowing the pattern you're used to rowing and to flex and go with what you feel in the boat. And that is, again, a change. It is an abrupt change to your technique and definitely not conducive to protecting your body.
Right, absolutely. Or, many athletes have low back issues, and this is where a lower back issue could get exasperated because perhaps in your own boat, you're okay because you know how you row and you're adapted to it. But if you do have a sensitive low back and you get into a boat that is really not a stable boat, that can be a great flare up as well. And that does happen sometimes.
That would be exasperating. I can totally agree. So take care, people. Common sense and think before you do.
Absolutely. And yes, and that goes for equipment too. If you get a new pair of oars, start blending in the new oars and the old oars, alternate gradually until you get used to one pair versus the other pair, rather than making a jump all of a sudden.
Marlene, it's been delightful having you back on the show. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, those great examples, and very timely reminder. So to all our listeners, till next time, bye-bye.
We are part of the Rowing Chat Podcast Network. Please tell your fellow rowers about the show. If you've learned just one helpful thing from today's episode, please consider supporting the show for as little as $1 per month by visiting fastermastersrowing.com/podcast.